Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined by co-host Eric Ibarra, a Roman Catholic. Today we're discussing, as a continuation of a previous video that we did, responses to Eastern Orthodox objections to the papacy. And I'll put a link to the first video in the description if you want to see the first one and you haven't watched it yet. But we're kind of picking up where we left off. But let me do this. Eric, I know you and I have spoken a lot about Edward Denny. This is, of course, an Anglican theologian who wrote quite a bit about the papacy. What was it? Cognis Satum, or I forget what was the
Satis Cognitum.
There it is, the papal document dealing with all kinds of papal claims, and he responded to it in this very, very long tome.
Yeah.
Called Papalism.
Wow. You have it in paperback with you?
Yeah, this one is paperback.
Wow, hold that up. Wow.
Yeah, now, of course, it's available on archive.org in PDF format, but I really like actual paperback versions so that I can make my millions of notes,
me too.
You can see here.
Yeah.
But again, it's called Papalism, and then he has, in true to good old Anglican form, a very long subtitle, a treatise on the claims of the papacy as set forth in the encyclical Satis Cognitum, primary source edition. So there it is. If anybody wants to read it, it's actually a very, very interesting work because he's dealing with all kinds of papal claims, and he goes through many church fathers, many councils, and he offers a response to the Roman Catholic view on the papacy. And of course, this is picked up a lot of times by Eastern Orthodox. So that's why we're bringing in an Anglican here in a discussion about Eastern Orthodox objections, because, Orthodox like to appeal to Denny. So when dealing with Denny's papalism, when you look through this thing, and he speaks about Matthew 16, and he deals with the patristic use of Matthew 16. He goes through all the different fathers and what their views were, and he shows that it is quite different, seemingly, than what we see at Vatican I when it comes to Matthew 16. So maybe could you give us your thoughts? What would you say to someone like Denny, who compiles quite a long list? And you'll even hear this from guys like Dr. James White, who will appeal to this list and say, look, the way that Vatican I speaks about the papacy and its use of Matthew 16 wasn't even the majority view of the church fathers. The majority of them were saying that this rock was this or it was that, but it wasn't the way in which it was understood in Vatican I. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a good point because, right around the 9th and 10th century, when the popes of Rome were defending their position against certain Eastern, opposition to certain commands that were being put down by the Pope. These popes were using scripture to justify their authority, whereas today you see a lot of references to church fathers. And I think it's because sometimes modern Catholic apologists aren't as confident with the scripture itself testifying to the papacy. But back then, the popes didn't really have any embarrassment at all. They would just cite Matthew 16, Luke 22, John 21, as if it was a given. Here's what I would say. We really have to nail down what it is that the Catholic Church is saying about Matthew 16, because often enough, a distortion about the Catholic teaching on Matthew 16 is made. And then that distortion is imposed upon Catholics as if we have to defend a distortion. So that distortion is that the rock has to be only the person of Peter and his performance to be right all the time. You get this especially from the less educated Protestant sphere, where, the idea of Peter being the rock is kind of like Achilles from Greek mythology. He's always out there. He's undefeated. and everything he says is right, and everything he puts down is wrong. So that's really not what Catholics intend to mean. In fact, some of the most explicit popes in history, that they were so explicit about their position of authority based upon the, let's call it the investment that Christ gave to Peter of authority. They would say that the rock is the faith of Peter. Pope Leo the Great, Pope Gelasius, Pope Nicholas I, even Pope Leo the Ninth in the 11th century. They were not under the impression that Peter's faith had to be secondary in the exegesis of that passage. They understood it as primary. So we have to realize that we're still in the same room with those exegetes who say that the rock is Peter's faith. So I guess that might lead to more questions.
Yeah.
But the Catechism of the Catholic Church to this day, includes that Peter's confession of faith is the rock upon which Christ built his church. And even St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologia, he even says that the rock is the confession of faith. You see this in some of the counter Reformation theologians like St. Robert Bellarmine. These are people who have no question about the papal office, and yet they still understand that Matthew 16 is primarily talking about the faith of Peter. The rock is his confession. So maybe that generates more questions. I don't know. What do you?
Well, it does, because you're basically saying that these different interpretations are compatible. Just because one says that maybe his faith is the rock, isn't mutually or exclusive or diametrically opposed to the Catholic claim that Peter himself is the rock. Right. When you look at Denny, my notes indicate here he has 8 fathers that say the rock is all of the apostles. 44 fathers say the rock is the faith of Peter. 16 fathers say Christ is the rock. Several fathers say the faithful are the rock, and so on. You're saying that these are not necessarily diametrically opposed to the claim that Peter. Now, my I guess further difficulty with this is when you look at some of the Catholic documents that speak about this matter, seems to indicate that this was the belief that was always held by everywhere, by everyone, everywhere, by all. How do you address that when 44 fathers seem to say differently, and perhaps some of them were silent about whether or not Peter was the rock? Maybe what they're saying isn't opposed to it, but they seem to be silent about it. What do we do with the Catholic claim that says this was always believed by everyone?
Yeah, well, every church father or even early Christian writer, for example, we wouldn't say Tertullian and Origen, for example, would be church fathers, but they factor in to this pool of early commentators. They're not always on trial answering a question about the position of the Bishop of Rome. So sometimes they're commenting on something, and if we don't really have too many commentaries on Matthew. Like we have St. John Chrysostom, whose commentary, in fact, supports the Vatican I interpretation. But the fathers, we have to really calibrate what we're expecting to be reading from them. A perfect example of that is if you have Pope St. Leo the Great, who nobody questions, believed in a universal jurisdiction based upon the divine investiture of Christ in St. Peter. Sometimes his commentary on Matthew 16 would have nothing to do with the papal office, have nothing to do with papal infallibility or papal jurisdiction or the necessity of being in communion with Rome. He just finds that Peter was fortified by this revelation from the Father, and that revelation from the Father caused him to confess our faith in Christ as God and Messiah, and that is the bedrock upon which the church is built. So we happen to have other writings of St. Leo where he goes into the papal office as being derived from that. But if we didn't have those other writings, we wouldn't say that he necessarily disagreed with them, just because in other passages he seems to talk about no papacy at all from Matthew 16. So you can be writing Christian commentary, biblical commentary, or making an argument, and then you cite Matthew 16, and you don't really have you don't really have the papal office of Rome in mind. What you have in mind here is that the faith that Peter made is the rock upon which the church is built. And I don't see any contradiction with that. I mean, so in other words, what I'm saying is that our expectation of what they should be saying doesn't require that they, oh, by the way, I know that I brought this up because I'm talking about Christology, but let's not forget that people 2,000 years from now are going to be concerned about what I think about this passage in toto. So I'm going to add here that there's something to do with the Bishop of Rome and a succession from Peter. They don't have to do that. But you do have many of the church fathers who really do comment on St. Peter being the rock, his faith fortifying him as the chief and the head of the apostles. I mean, from all the lights of both East and West. So we have to be careful. What is it that we're looking for in these early church fathers? Are we looking for them to give an exposition on the papacy every time they cite Matthew 16? I think that's a little bit overboard.
Now, talking here about Peter as the rock and his confession of faith too being considered the rock, what would you say to those who say, look, as Orthodox, we can affirm the Pope is the rock, Peter is the rock, and his successor is the Pope. Peter's the rock as long as his confession is solid, as long as it is the rock, as long as he makes a solid profession of faith. But right now, with the Filioque and some of the papal claims, the papacy has, fallen away from the faith, and so he can't be called the rock because his profession is not solid.
Yeah, that's a good point. To the very first part where you have Orthodox saying that, we don't have any problem with Peter as the rock, which is true. You have some Orthodox scholars who they're even embarrassed about the Orthodox objections on the word Petros and Petra. And they just say, look, we need to stop wasting time and just admit that Peter, yes, it's the confession, but it's Peter's confession, so it fortifies him. And the early church hymnography is this is a very important part that some, I think, new to Eastern Orthodoxy or Protestants don't realize, is that while there may not be formulae in Orthodox Christian dogma as plenty as in Roman Catholicism, there is a silent or implicit infallibility in her liturgy because of the rule lex orandi, lex credende. What is the law of prayer is the law of belief. And so you have the Meneon. Orthodox listeners will know what I'm talking about. It means of the month. It's a cycle of divine offices and prayers that the Orthodox give. And in those offices, you have offices that include exaltations of St. Peter as the rock, as the foundation, and really no hint about his faith. And you have other places where it does talk about his faith. You have other places where it talks about Christ being the rock who made Peter the rock. So I think you're right that the Orthodox really shouldn't waste time about that. And I think they should just say, all right, fine, Peter's the rock. Fine, Peter was given the keys. Fine, Rome was primate. Fine, he had a leading position at the ecumenical councils. Fine, when there was a problem in the East that needed an appeal, they gave it to Rome. Fine. But the problem is now, because of the Filioque, because of papal supremacy, because of the liturgical impositions that happened in the 11th century, it's sort of fell off the map. Well, the first thing I would say is this. As Catholics, we would see it as gratuitous to say that Rome is in heresy because of the Filioque and all these things. So we would have to be willing to sit down and talk about the intricacies of the Filioque, how it came into the creed, and things like that. But that takes time, and we don't have time for that. What I would say is that the Filioque is a doctrine that is in the Church Fathers. And the Orthodox, up until recent, they have always had a very high view of the Church Fathers. And to have this idea that the Western Fathers were completely in error about the Filioque, they were stumbling when it came to that issue, whereas the East, that had the more pristine, more clear and clean teaching, was the one that had it right. That mindset was never in the Eastern Byzantium phronema. And we know that because at the Council of Florence, which is really the last time the Orthodox and the Catholics got together, the last time this happened, one of the prominent members, his name was Bessarion, he was the Archbishop of Nicaea. At first, when you read through the council, if you read through Joseph Gill's account of the Council of Florence, Bessarion was in there. He was resistant to the papal and to the Latin position, but we have certain records of his, post ex facto perspective, and he said, I was amazed, I was shocked that fathers from the Latin West and fathers from the Greek East were talking about the Filioque. And he says something that is pertinent to what I'm saying here. He said, it's impossible that they were all misled. So we have to be careful. If the Greek Orthodox, or today mostly, the Greco-Slavic, and all the other autocephalous bodies, if they want to say that the Rome is in heresy because of the Filioque, well, that accusation goes farther than they think it does, and it gets into a lot of the saints in their calendar, and that gets kind of messy. That kind of, it's like an internal combustion. It's not really what the real Orthodox think about the fathers, that they really have the capacity to err that much. Now, they would say, oh, well, the Filioque before the 11th century was a economic Filioque, or it was something akin to Gregory of Cyprus's eternal manifestation. Well, again, now we're going on to deeper theological details. So that we wouldn't have time for that. But the other thing with papal supremacy, they said, well, Rome is not a functioning primate anymore because of papal supremacy. Well, I would say the same thing. And Orthodox scholars today don't really dispute this that much. So if you pick up, Father John McGuckin, or Father Thomas Hopko, or Dr. George Demikopoulos, Yaroslav Pelikan, Alexander Schmemann, all these guys that were prominent voices in the Orthodox world, they all admit that the papal claims were being made and were being exercised centuries before the schism. So that draws a question. So then you're saying Rome is no longer the primate of the church and doesn't have the prerogatives of St. Peter because of these heresies. But it's very apparent by historians that are non-Catholic that these claims were being made and exercised hundreds of years before the schism. So that calls into question of whether those bishops of Rome were in a leadership position to begin with on that criteria. Some of those popes are saints in the Orthodox Church. So I think the charge is a good one. You know, hey, we agree with Peter as the rock. We agree with the successors of Peter in Rome. We agree that Rome was the first see. We agree he received appeals. We agree that he had a presidency over the council, even when he wasn't there through his legates. But now the curtains have closed because it's Rome's in heresy. Well, we really got to examine those charges of heresy to see if more is being said, because I think too much is being said, and so much is being said that it puts a flood in the house of the Orthodox with regard to their past saints.
You know, I know you've read this book. I read it quite a while back. The Papacy of Peter by John Meyendorff. Looking through some of my notes here, and he readily admits that Peter is the rock. He says the Apostle Peter is the rock on which the church is built and will remain the rock until the coming of the Lord. This was actually Athanasius, I guess is how you say his name, his contribution. So it wasn't actually Meyendorff himself, but I'm sure Meyendorff would agree with that. So, of course, there's going to be a readily admission that Peter is the rock. But what would you say to this objection, which I find on page 81, where he says, yeah, okay, Peter's the rock, but every church, every local church is also the rock. Here's the quote. It says, "You try to present Peter as teacher of Rome alone, while the Divine Father spoke of the promise made to him by the Savior as having a Catholic meaning, and as referring to all those who believe and believe you. You force yourself into a narrow and false interpretation, ascribing it to Rome alone. If this were true, it would be impossible for every church of the faithful, and not only that of Rome, to possess the Savior properly, and for each church to be founded on the Savior properly, and for each church to be founded on the rock, i.e. on the doctrine of Peter in conformity with the promise." A lot going on there. Yeah. But essentially one of the objections here is, why are you singling out Peter? Because this would take away from the fact that every local church with every bishop is Peter and is the rock.
Yeah. So, you know, this is one of those areas where we often get told we're doing mental gymnastics. Okay. But I really want to invite the Orthodox into the gym, because ever since the Alexandrine school of biblical interpretation, the idea of having one and many meanings to a certain passage is not foreign to Hebrew and Christian interpretation of ideas. So, for example, when we are baptized, what is the paradigm of that? The paradigm of that is when the Lord went to St. John the Baptist and he was baptized in the Jordan River, and, you know, the heavens opened up and a voice from heaven came down. The Father said, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." Well, when we are baptized, we enter into that office of Christ as prophet, priest, and king. All the baptized do. Every single baptized. And yet we recognize that there are a certain prophetical office, there's a certain ruling office, and there's a certain sanctifying office in the church that not everyone has. So while you have this universal enterprise of being a prophet, being a king, and being a priest, there's still a hierarchical difference between lay people and clergy. In the same way with the keys of the kingdom, it's the same way. In one sense, like Origen says, all believers carry the keys of the kingdom. When I go to my neighbor and I say, "Hey, brother, do you know the meaning of life? Our Lord Jesus Christ came and revealed the God of heaven to us." I'm already working somewhat in bringing that person to the keys of the kingdom that are opening the kingdom up for him. So you have a lot of patristic authors who even put the keys in the hands of anybody, but that does not take away from their insistence that the bishops carry the keys in a very much unique way.
Making distinctions.
Making distinctions, right.
Yeah.
So Saint Cyprian of Carthage, who, by the way, we hear this from Anglicans and Orthodox and Protestants. They love going to Saint Cyprian right after saying that the rock means the faith and not Peter, and they go to Cyprian. For Cyprian, the rock is Peter. Not only is it Peter, but it's his office, and he thinks that the office of bishop is the rock upon which the church is built. And so here we go again, where each church has the office of Peter. That's patristic. I think that no Catholic should deny that. But the question is there a unique station of the chair of Peter that's dissimilar to the others? And we have so much evidence from the church fathers that Rome is. So it's very simple. I mean, I brought that analogy of the Alexandrine school because any of the Orthodox or Protestants who are listening and who have studied historical theology, they'll know about this thorny issue of typological interpretation, allegorical interpretation. I don't think any of that should go away. All of a sudden, when it comes to the papacy and Peter, now everything has to be wooden, literal, one meaning, no multivalent meanings. I think that's not fair. I think that, I think that if none of the fathers expanded these ideas, maybe they would have a point. But there's just too much evidence that singles out Peter, singles out Rome.
I want to ask one more question on this, and then we're gonna move forward to some other objections. Real quick, could you maybe comment on this objection that we also find in the same book of Meyendorff, and this is actually part of Meyendorff's contribution. He quotes an author saying, quote, "We recognize Peter as Coryphus in conformity with the necessary order, but Peter, not the Pope. For in the past, the Pope was the first one among us when his thought and mind were in agreement with ours. Let the identity of faith be reestablished, and then let him receive the primacy." This is kind of hinting at several objections, but one of them being, okay, the primacy that you see with Peter doesn't necessarily apply to the Pope and his successors, although he's making other objections here too. That's one that's implicit there. So what would you say to those who say, yeah, okay, all these promises and all these concessions that we make about Peter apply to Peter, but that's not the Pope?
Yeah, so what's interesting is we don't really see those kind of objections until the later centuries. And it's so in one sense, it's kind of a novel objection. And I think that Father Meyendorff himself in that chapter, he even says that the debates on the papacy really begin after the second millennium begins already. You have a lot of Byzantine authors who are giving very strange interpretations on the past, and it's almost as if you're wondering, did they read the ecumenical councils? Did they read the church fathers? Did they read canon law? None of these things seem to filter in to some of these statements that we hear like this. To that statement, I would simply say this, that on a scriptural basis, we can argue that if Christ established Peter as a chief head of the apostles, for the sake of maintaining unity, and if all the church fathers believed that principle applies to the local church, where you need one bishop to govern the many in order to avoid schism. If that applies on the local level, why wouldn't it apply on the universal level? And if it applies on the universal level, then who would qualify for that position but who all the councils and church fathers have recognized as the successor of St. Peter? That author who said that, I don't know if it was Nicholas Meserides or whichever Byzantine author who said that, all we would have to do is open up the Meneon, the cycle of divine office. You go to June 30th. If some of the readers here have access to a monastery, or if you happen to be a very unique person and have a full Meneon in your house, go to June 30th and read the whole hymn. And you will see, many lines where it said that not only is Peter the rock and foundation, but they even say that Peter's the first bishop of Rome, which is interesting because that kind of goes against what some more modern scholarship thinks on St. Peter in his station at Rome. But it's very clear there that there's a succession from Peter, and that Rome inherits these prerogatives, and really it goes back to sources, right? When you go to Oxford, if you go to Yale, if you go to Harvard, and there's a debate on history, everything is sources. Where is your source? Did you read that in the original? Where did you get that from? What copy are you? Where did they dig up that copy? Is that the same copy that they dug up here or there? So everything is sources. So I would just turn the tables and say, look, you have plenty of sources that belong to you, not to me, because I'm a Roman Catholic. A Roman Catholic, according to Orthodox principles, a Roman Catholic is part of a faction that was created in the 11th, 12th, 13th century. So if we bring sources from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century in domains very crucial to the Orthodox, like the ecumenical councils, the Eastern Fathers, where they say Rome inherits the prerogatives and the investments of St. Peter, they are the ones that have to answer the question, not me. They're the ones that have to explain why a Byzantine author from the 12th century is complaining about how the privileges of Peter belong to Peter and his role in Jerusalem and Antioch, and that's it. They have their own, library of church fathers that say something entirely different.
I want to talk a little bit about Sardica next, but I did have one more follow-up question. Yeah. Promise I'm not gonna, camp out here too much.
No, go where you want.
Out of Cyprian. So I have to ask this. This is coming from, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Abba Guet, however you say it. The guy is, I know you know him. He's a Catholic convert to Orthodoxy back in the 1800s. I want to say this is an 1866 edition. It's coming from page 79. How do you say his name, by the way? Have you ever heard?
I have some French Canadian friends that I wanted to ask. In fact, I was invited onto Discord by some French Orthodox last year. I should have asked them, but I think it's Father Abe Gauthier.
Gauthier, okay. Guettee, for anybody who wants to look it up. I think it's also in the public domain. Yeah. Well, anyways, he talks a lot about Cyprian. But here's one thing that he does bring up with Cyprian. He says, quote, and this is coming from Cyprian directly, the other apostles certainly were just what Peter was, having the same honor and power as he. At least I think that's a quote, because he uses the very odd little cross for his quotes at the bottom there. So I believe this is a direct quote from Cyprian. I haven't been able to verify it before, but assuming this is the case, or at the very least somebody who would say, okay, all of the apostles have the same honor and power as Peter, and therefore all of their successors have the same honor and power as well.
Sure.
So Peter and the Pope doesn't have any kind of distinct power and authority. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I would say, well, first, I would recommend everybody pick up that book, because that's definitely going to be one of those books you're going to want to read, whether you're a Catholic or an Orthodox or Protestant, because it is one of those heavy hitters. I would say that he's misinterpreting Saint Cyprian, and here's why. He's quoting the treatise on unity, the treatise on the unity of the church, and in that document, he talks about what it means for the church to be one, and he begins talking about using the metaphor of a font and a stream, the sun and the rays. How there's the source, the font and the sun, and then there's the emanation from that source. And the idea is, if the rays of the sun depart from the sun, they're no longer one with the sun. And if a stream becomes severed from its font, then it's no longer one with the font. But then he gets to Peter as the font, or the origin of the unity of the church. And out of Peter comes this font of ecclesial governors or officers. He doesn't make Peter completely equal with the others, because he says this: although they were equal in power and honor, yet he gave the chair to one. So right there, you have an exclusivity and a uniqueness. So the question is, what is that exclusivity and what is that uniqueness? Because if Peter is absolutely equal with the other apostles, then his having the chair means nothing. So the question is, what does it mean for him to have the chair? And what the early church fathers would argue, like Augustine, Optatus of Milevi, is they would argue that the chair represents the center principle of unity, which you can't escape that orbit. You have to stay within that source in order to remain legitimately united to the church. And so while Peter has the same power to forgive sins, the same power the same office to proclaim the gospel as the others, yet he occupies the chair. He's the only one that occupies the chair. And so I would say that Cyprian he's saying there is an equality, and then there's a sense in which Peter's not equal. And so we really got to pause and find out what he means by Peter not being equal, and what that cathedra really means. Because for Cyprian, the cathedra is very important. Because if you were to say that occupying the cathedra is really nothing, it's just a symbol, it's just an honorific position, then that would mean bishops simply have an honorific influence and they just have their 2 cents to offer a bunch of equals. And Cyprian did not have that ecclesiology. Now, Cyprian did run into some issues with the Pope of Rome during his life. And in fact, I recommend everybody read that chapter that Michael was pointing to in this book, The Primacy of Peter, by Father Nicholas Afanasiev, because he goes into the inconsistency of Saint Cyprian. So this is an Orthodox scholar, one of the best scholars in the 20th century, who he goes into Cyprian and he realizes that there's an internal contradiction in Cyprian's thought. And I happen to agree with him. I hate to have to agree with it, but I happen to I agree with him, because Saint Cyprian's his theory of government really did clash when he realized that he was not going to be able to go along with the Pope. And so that really, he ran into some conflicts in his episcopate. And so anyway, I don't want to get long-winded on that one, but for more about Saint Cyprian, read that chapter by Father Nicholas Afanasieff.
Yeah, I think that's helpful because Cyprian's going to come up all the time.
Oh yeah.
And by the way, I was able to verify his quote there. He doesn't give a proper citation, but I was able to find it in Cyprian's first treatise, paragraph 4. So it was an authentic quote.
Yeah.
Close enough at the very least. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Sardica. So would you say that Sardica was merely made a review court where they're going to delegate their their judgment and their authority to another court, or was it actually made a final court of appeals where it could decide things on its own? Speaking of Rome, of course.
Yeah. So Sardica is an interesting council, but basically, yes. In short, the canons 3, 4, and 5, Rome is simply. The idea is that local or provincial synods don't lock the door completely. There's a door that can be opened, and that door is for the Bishop of Rome to review the case, and if he judges that the one accused has a chance at a retrial for the sake of justice, because of lack of evidence, because of lack of, maybe there was whatever reason there was, he thinks that it could qualify as for a retrial, he could actually open it up again and let the local courts in that region review the case, and in some instances, if he can't find local judges that were proximate to the original, he could send a legate of his own to kind of oversee the situation. So yes, the canons of Sardica, it really does give us it's not like, oh, whatever the Pope says, is what's going to happen. But, so let me just answer you shortly. Yes.
This is just my impression. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that, okay, yes, the East adopted this policy here at Sardica, but it seems like it was very rarely used. Would you disagree with that?
No, I think you have your antennas out. It was rarely followed. I mean, we have a situation in 361 and 394 where Eastern bishops are flipping through those canons and they're trying to get Rome involved. But for the most part, accused bishops just wrote to Rome, and sometimes Rome would just immediately overturn the judgment, or he would petition the emperors for an ecumenical council. But for example, Eutyches of Constantinople, he was a bishop who was judged in Constantinople by Saint Flavian at a council in Constantinople in 448. And Eutyches appealed to the Pope, and the Pope Leo at the time he knew that the canons of Sardica were being activated, but he didn't really follow the exact stricture that the text of those canons say. He just got involved and started writing. He wrote a big letter to Flavian, and when the council was held at Ephesus in 449, you had people writing appeals to the Pope after that. And Pope Leo would just say, "Oh, that is all null. Everything that was decided at that council is null, and this is what has to be." So we see a lot of Orthodox and Protestants. They love to point out the Council of Sardica because they think by reading it shows limitations, it shows mediation, it shows things that are contrary. I think it's contrary. To this day, the Roman Rota and the apostolic signatura, nobody goes directly to the Pope, even to this day. But anyhow, it was rarely followed, like you said. And in many cases, the Eastern Fathers, the Eastern Councils, were quite ready to receive an overturning of the Pope by the Pope's judgment without having all these proximate review councils and all that. So, yeah, you're right about that, and I agree.
Trying to find the actual place here in Denny. I think I'm actually pretty close. I want to say it's 117. Yeah, sure it is. Page 59 in my version, but it's it's paragraph 117, I guess is what you would call it. He makes this argument. Okay, so Peter is given the keys of the kingdom, Matthew 16, but in Matthew 18, the rest of the apostles are given the same. So why are you making a distinction between Peter and the apostles based upon the keys when all of them are given the keys of the kingdom? That's effectively his argument here. And you hear this often repeated by Orthodox. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, local priests have power of the keys when they absolve sins. But nobody's going to say that their keys can beat up the keys of the bishop or the keys of the metropolitan, perhaps. Look, the Patriarch of Moscow, who exercises the most power, I would say, in the Orthodox Church today and has been. No priest who has the keys in Moscow or underneath Patriarch Kirill is going to say that he has the power of the keys to equate with Patriarch Kirill or with his local bishop. I know that, there's an organization here. You've got your synod, you've got your autocephalous synod. Patriarch Kirill can't intervene. I understand that, but let's be honest, it happens. Again, this goes back to that issue of having you have this concept, and then there's a hierarchical differentiation. Yes, all the apostles have the keys. One of the phenomena that took place in the third, fourth century with the imperialization of Christianity is bishops no longer resided in one church. And so you had priests or presbyters, archpresbyters, archpriests, archdeacons. You had these under clergy. They weren't called under clergy, but you had these men who were presbyters who were basically acting like a bishop. And they had the keys of the kingdom to absolve sins. They had the keys of the kingdom to impose discipline, fasting, the canonical ban when somebody was caught in public sin. But that doesn't mean now that the bishop doesn't have a hierarchical supremacy. He does. All the presbyters are accountable to the bishop. So you can have the keys dispersed in a community of governors while there is one who has a certain guardianship, a certain entrustment with those keys that is supreme over the rest. And I think the fathers bear that out.
It's funny you mentioned that nobody would argue that, the bishop is going to have higher authority over the priest. Isn't this one of the things that Erickson brings up? Isn't this one of the very issues that's disputed sometimes among Orthodox theologians? Maybe my memory is failing me here, but it seems like he addresses that somewhere.
Yeah, he talks about he uses the word radical. Yeah, there's a radical unity between the bishops, and for Father John Erickson, who, by the way, his work is phenomenal. I don't want to belittle him as a scholar. The man has broke his sweat in scholarship, and I've had private correspondence with him. He's just an encyclopedia.
Oh yeah.
But I would say that his position on the primacy of the churches is wrong, and he takes the position in that book, The Challenge of the Past, that so you have equal apostles, equal bishops, and the only thing that causes a differentiation is the preeminence of the secular city. And sure, like the last video, we talked about that. That certainly played a role. But it's as if he saw no room for this apostolic and divine hierarchy.
Which is, this is an issue that comes up a lot because, quite a few people want to say, I was actually reading Sullivan the other day, who was interacting with Hans Küng in his work Infallible, where Küng was basically saying, there's no reason to believe that there was a mono episcopate, in the first century, or that the bishops actually come from the apostles, immediately, as if the apostles actually instituted the office of bishops. Now, what Sullivan wants to say is this is still done providentially by God, but not directly by the apostles, and that was Küng's argument. And I guess, hey, maybe I'm just dim-witted, but why have we conceded that position? why have we conceded the position that that the apostles did not actually institute this as a divine office? At the very least, when we see evidence of it in the early 2nd century with Ignatius, and you see the threefold division there, and it would seem that you have some patristic sources that indicate that this was an institution from the apostles. I don't know why some of these things are still in dispute.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that because there's one Anglican convert to Catholicism, Frederick Kinsman. If any of the listeners want to read somebody who came from the Church of England to Catholicism, but actually dealt with Eastern Orthodoxy, because St. John Henry Newman didn't really deal with the Eastern Orthodox. Frederick Kinsman saw the Eastern Orthodox objections to the papacy as parallel to the Protestant objections to the monoepiscopate. And so for him, he was like, well, the Orthodox accept the monoepiscopate, even though there is this underground tunnel from the apostles, because you have the apostles and then the very primitive documents like St. Clement's letter to the Church of Corinth, some of the writings in St. Irenaeus, some of the earlier documents that almost speak about presbyters, and that's it. Like they're all bishops, they're all presbyters. And so there's like this underground tunnel, and then all of the sudden, and St. Ignatius is the exception, all of the sudden, you have this universal idea about one man as bishop over the presbyters by a divine organization. So many Protestant historical theologians, going back, have recognized that the monoepiscopate is just as difficult to prove as the papacy. What's sad is there's many Orthodox and Catholics who are in academia who have just sort of taken that position and they've run with it. So what they do is they'll say, well, St. Ignatius of Antioch believed in the monoepiscopate, but that's just in Antioch and in Ephesus and in certain other areas in Asia Minor. That really wasn't the case in Rome or in Africa. Rome didn't have one bishop until the year 150 with Anacletus or whoever, I forgot. And I don't know why Catholics and Orthodox scholars sometimes take this position, because it really has enough to break the floor beneath us completely. If all the apostles made were equal presbyters, and then later on, after the apostles had already passed, later on, the church decided that, hey, it would be good if we just had one representative. And yeah, he's one of us essentially, but we'll make him like a higher one of us, and we'll call him the one bishop, and we'll just be the presbyters. If that really happened, and certainly that's what Lutherans believe, that's what Methodists believe, most Methodists. That's what a lot of Catholics and Orthodox historians believe. If that's really true, then that means that the office of bishop is not a divine organization. And Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism have always taught that it's a divine institution. It would completely throw Roman Catholic and Orthodox ecclesiology and Oriental, Ethiopian, Syriac, Armenian, all of them. It would just throw it into complete disarray. And the Orthodox, I know they don't really like to talk about formula, but at the Council of Jerusalem in 1672, they talk about the divine institution of the bishop. So that's never been contested in Orthodoxy. So to see Orthodox historians do that only shows that their doubts about the papacy trickle into their doubts about the monoepiscopacy, and you really have to sit back and think that really does happen.
Father Sullivan tries to save the whole thing by saying, well, okay, the sense of the faithful lets us know that this was a divine institution only in the sense that he's providentially spoken through the unanimity of his people, but not actually that Jesus instituted bishops or that the apostles instituted bishops, but that this was just something that God instituted providentially through the consensus of his people. But I don't even see why that is necessary to really take that position, because, okay, you said that some want to object and say that this was just something that we see in Ignatius's area, but it wasn't the case elsewhere where you have a multitude of bishops in one territory. But I guess I haven't seen the evidence to indicate that what we see with Ignatius was an anomaly. And I know some people like to point to Clement of Rome and his letter, an indication that there were elders there, but I still don't see that ruling out a monoepiscopate. So I guess I'm just not seeing the evidence for their objection.
Yeah, and it really calls into question the quality of continuity, because as soon as you put a crack that deep into the tradition of Catholicism or Orthodoxy, it's only a matter of time before you get a really smart guy come in and say, oh, well, I see that you've already got this big of a crack in there. Maybe there's more cracks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I converted to Catholicism back in 2012, I was listening to a lot of lectures by Scott Hahn, and I'm trying to find the book. I want to say it's behind me, so I'm not able to get it, but he has a book called Rome Sweet Home that's about his conversion story. I'm pretty sure it's in there that he tries to connect Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. And so essentially, for anybody who hasn't heard of the argument, you have the keys of the kingdom being given to Peter, the authority to bind and loose in Matthew 16. And that very language that's used there is very reminiscent of the language that we find in Isaiah 22, especially when it comes to binding and loosing. And this office that we see in Isaiah 22 of binding and loosing was tied into the steward of the king, who took the position of the king in his absence and had the authority to lock and unlock the gate of the city. So he had keys. But he was basically the king to the people in the king's absence. And this was clearly not an office that died out with him. If the steward died, the king would just get another steward. So,
right.
So clearly what's going on in Matthew 16 isn't going to die out with Peter. when Peter dies, it's there's going to be successors there. So this is what Scott Hahn argues to try to say that there are perpetual successors to what we see going on with the office instituted by Christ and the commission there in Matthew 16. So how would you respond to somebody who says, look, this is an entirely novel interpretation? It sounds interesting because there is some language that is very reminiscent of Isaiah 22, but nobody in the patristic era maintained this view. So that's a good indication that this is novel. Would you say that this is novel, or have you found instances where church fathers actually made the connection between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16?
Yeah, that's a good question, Michael. I remember when I was an Anglican, I was very frustrated with this part of Scott Hahn's book because I saw it was just too much being read into it, number one. Number two, it seems to me that if it was a knock them down, drag them out proof of the papacy, it would have been utilized more by the popes and by the bishops when they relied on the pope's power. And I just don't see it being used in those texts. In fact, all we really see is Matthew 16, Luke 23, John 21. Isaiah 22 should have been right there, with it. So in my personal opinion, I think that the parallelism it matches very well. But in terms of a functional apologetic for somebody on the outside, especially a critical reader of the Bible, a critical reader of the patristic era and of the medieval era, it's probably not going to work as well, because they're going to say, where is this being used? And I know some people say that St. John Cassian and a couple of other people make a reference to St. Peter carrying the keys of the house, which may be an allusion to Isaiah 22. In fact, I mean, I warm up to it when I think about it. What St. John Cassian said, and I think St. Bede. It's either St. Bede or St. Isidore. I can't remember who make an allusion to this keys of the house. It wouldn't be my handgun. It wouldn't be one of the bullets in the magazine that I'm carrying in my handgun next to me. It would be like a candle that's full of dust in the basement. Like, hey, here's this extra cool thing that might be the case. But it's not a sharp. It's not my sword that I carry around, to try and prove the papacy.
I want to say that Abba G, we're going to call him Abba G, however you say his name, Guet, whatever. I want to say that he actually deals with the issue of Victor. And this is something that you hear all the time with the Quartodeciman issue. In that controversy there, it's often claimed that, well, Victor excommunicated the churches of Asia Minor, and therefore this shows that he had, supreme power over other jurisdictions. But I want to say it was Irenaeus that Eusebius says came and rebuked him. Although he didn't necessarily say you don't have the authority to do this, he was just saying that this isn't the right thing to do. Well, the appeal there is made to Victor and his excommunication of the bishops there in Asia Minor. But what would you say to those Eastern Orthodox who say, well, look, you have other instances in which bishops are excommunicating other bishops? Maybe the Bishop of Alexandria is excommunicating the Bishop of Jerusalem or somebody else. That doesn't necessarily mean that he has, plenary power over all the other churches, as we see in Vatican I. So, where's the consistency?
Yeah, it would almost seem as though now there's a bunch of popes with universal jurisdiction, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good thing to bring out. In the early church, especially in the East, they had what's called the communion of letters, the letters of communion.
Mhm.
And when a new bishop would come into when a new bishop was ordained, he would write. Later on in the medieval era, it was called a synodicon of faith. He would write a statement of faith to send to the nearby bishops, so that the nearby bishops would go to they had a document of names of bishops, and if one of those bishops passed away and a new one was ordained in his place, they wouldn't know about it right away until this letter or a confession of faith was being written to the churches. And then so the bishop would come in and scratch off the name of the predecessor and put in the new bishop. And that book of names was called the diptycha, they call it the diptychs of the church, of the names. And those names were recited at the table of the Lord, at the altar of the Lord, to signify Eucharist, body of Christ, bishops who are in communion. And whenever a bishop saw that one of those other bishops was deviating from the faith, or deviating from the canons, or deviating from some rule that the church agreed upon, they would go ahead and remove that name from the diptychs, and the name would no longer be recited at the divine service. And the idea was, we're no longer in communion with that bishop or those bishops. Okay, so each bishop had the prerogative to say which of the others was going to be welcomed onto his list. That doesn't mean that each church had its own little papacy and the bishop was the final word. That all that means is that bishops could take action, and the idea was, if another bishop was in heresy, or if another bishop was breaking the canons and he wouldn't listen and he was obstinate, then it was the responsibility of a bishop to say, we're no longer associated with that bishop or that church for the sake of our own purity. Because if we retain communion with that bishop, we carry his guilt on our shoulders. And so we have to excise him from the list. So each bishop had that prerogative. Now, if the bishop of Corinth excommunicated the bishop of Thessaloniki, that's one thing. But if the bishop of Antioch and the bishop of Ephesus maintained communion with the bishop of Thessaloniki, they were not committing a sin. Okay? Because Corinth is acting within its own capacity as a local church to remove the bishop of Thessaloniki from their communion. So if Antioch is still in communion with Thessaloniki, and if Ephesus is still in communion with Thessaloniki, they haven't committed a sin, because Corinth's decree of excommunication doesn't have a bind that goes over the heads of the other churches. It's simply pertinent to that local church. Now, when the Bishop of Rome would issue a universal condemnation or a universal excommunication, it was not simply Rome versus that church. Now, if the other churches wanted to keep the communion of that church, they incurred a sin, because now they're acting against the universal jurisdiction of the Pope. So, when a Pope excommunicates a bishop publicly, universally, and makes it very clear, I know that this sounds kind of anachronistic, like today's the more recent late medieval popes doing papal bulls and excommunications. But the bishops way back then, they knew about certain formalities of writing, certain genres of writing. They adopted the Roman style. And so when the Pope issued a universal excommunication, all the churches had to adhere to it. There was no longer awaiting, another trial until it could, until a higher authority examines the issue. Now, there were instances where people ignored the power of the Pope in doing so, especially the emperor. The emperor, the first millennium is not this perfectly smooth picture of ecclesiology. You've got the emperor in one corner, and he's weighing in at 230 pounds, and he's got this record, and you got the Pope in another corner, and he's weighing in at this. You've got the patriarchs, weighing in another corner. You've got the monks in another corner. So you have a lot of fighting going on, and the Latin West, when the Latin West got free of the Byzantine, when the iconoclastic era came into be with Emperor Leo the Isaurian, it became a hassle to deal with the Eastern Emperor, and this is one of the reasons why that led to the transition of the West to rely on the Frankish powers to defend Rome. When the papacy gets more free, then it starts to say, yeah, we used to fight in that ring with you guys, but this whole time we knew that we always had authority over you guys, but we would jab, and we would do, we would give a right cross, and we would fight with you guys. But now that we're free and we've got none of these imperial entanglements anymore, we're going to start making it very clear that the successor of Peter doesn't deserve any challenges to his authority. So, again, a bishop removing another bishop from his diptychs, fine. When Rome does it, it has a universal significance, and you incur a sin when you resist it. Now, that's the theory. The Orthodox is going to say, no, that's not true, because, you had this church who didn't recognize it, and this council didn't recognize it, and this. Okay, well, this is not a one-punch knockout. Nobody's saying that the debate between Catholics and Orthodox is a one-punch knockout. We do have to get our glasses on. We do have to get our microscopes out and look at the evidence and weigh everything. I think that the Roman side wins out.
Well, let's continue to look at some of that evidence. Let's talk about St. Irenaeus. Of course, he was writing in the 2nd century, so very likely that he was still writing in Greek. Extremely unlikely that he would have been writing in Latin. But we do have some of his works that survived, but only in Latin, as I understand it. Yes. Now, Abbe G, as we'll call him, raises this objection. But first, let me actually read the quote, or at least part of the quote from Irenaeus. Here's what Irenaeus says about Rome. For every church, that is to say, the faithful who are from all places are obliged to go toward that church. Now, there's a dispute here on the translation. The Latin is convenire ad, could be go toward. Some Catholic translations will say must agree with, or to agree with. All right, so that is to say the faithful who are from all places are obliged to go toward that church because of the most powerful principality. In this church, the tradition of the apostles has been preserved by those who are all countries. So here's what Abbe says in his commentary about this text. The Romish theologians choose a bad translation of this passage in order to find it as an argument in favor of the papal sovereignty. Instead of saying that the faithful of the whole world were obliged to go to Rome because it was the capital of the empire, the seat of the government, and the center of all business, civil and political, they translate convenire ad by the words to agree with, which is a mistranslation. And he goes on to level his objections textually to the Catholic understanding there. So why would you defend Catholics who appeal to Irenaeus in this passage in particular to say that all of the other churches must agree with Rome, when it seems that it could be reasonably translated that the other churches simply must come to Rome?
Yeah. So I would say that there is a legitimate there is a legitimate argument about the Latin there. But I would just say, look, let's drop our pencils here. Okay. Let's just think logically. What is St. Irenaeus talking about? St. Irenaeus is talking about knowing the content, the authentic content of the apostolic tradition. And he says he doesn't want to give a long list of all the apostolic churches with all the apostolic succession, with all the episcopal lists from all these different churches. So he goes to the one where his argument would be made in short. He goes to the place where he wouldn't have to go at length because it's sufficient in itself. Plus, he gives it, I think, Philippi and some other churches underneath. But Rome has this sufficiency in his mind to sort of, take away from having to write down all the lists. Why would he do that if he did not believe that Rome had some superior role in teaching that content of the apostolic faith? And we don't have time to go into like the Latin, but if any of the readers, my favorite book, my favorite book on the papacy and history is written by Trevor Jalland. See, this is all duct taped up. It's real ghetto. It's just an old copy. I have another copy that's new. I don't touch until this one goes.
Mm-hmm.
Go to Church and the Papacy, Trevor Jalland. It's on Archives. And go to the chapter on Irenaeus. And here's an Anglican, a non-Catholic. He's got no interest in becoming Catholic. You get that from reading the whole book. And he just basically makes it plain. Look, we need to stop all this and just admit that what Irenaeus is saying is that at the time, if you want to say at the time, fine. At the time, Rome was a doctrinal norm to judge the faith by, like a standard or a ruler to judge, to measure things. Mm-hmm. That Rome was the standard, and that you could just go to Rome and get the answer, and it should be sufficient. Does that prove the Vatican I papacy and Pope Pius IX and all this crazy stuff? No. Mm-hmm. But what it does tell us is that at this time, Rome was seen as reliable.
Sure.
And we see at this time the popes exercising jurisdiction outside of in foreign territory and making claims to this investment that they have in the Apostle Peter. If you want to get another Anglican, he's really good. He wrote the Apostolic Early Christian Doctrines. J.N.D. Kelly.
Oh yeah.
Exactly. If you get his book, the Oxford Dictionary of the Popes.
Yeah, that's a fun one.
Yeah, and just start reading what he says about the early popes, and then put that next to what Irenaeus says. And Irenaeus may not be explicit evidence, but circumstantially, you've got these early popes making these claims, and then you've got Irenaeus making these claims. And when you put them together, I think what you have is good evidence, not one-punch knockouts, not knock them down, drag them out, but you have something seriously to consider.
You were talking about, okay, in Irenaeus's day, the view was that Rome was very solid. And look, a whole lot of Orthodox are going to say, yeah, for quite a while, Rome had a great reputation with its many martyrs, beyond the fact that it was, the city of the capital of the empire. It had all of these great martyrs. It had all of these popes who were wonderful defenders of the faith. But that's not the case today. So the objection goes that, okay, yeah, back in the day, Rome was great, but today you have Pope Francis. In fact, this is basically the objection that you got with your debate with Jay. If you call it a debate, it was basically just a show where he came on and y'all were talking. But in this debate with Jay, anytime you would try to bring, a point, make a point, he would just immediately jump the topic and go straight to clown masses, Pope Francis, Pachamama kind of stuff, So the objection is, yeah, you can talk about how great the popes were back in the day, how wonderful they were defending the faith, and even what other saints thought about Rome, like Irenaeus. You can talk about that all day long, but that doesn't apply to Pope Francis today. So how do you respond?
Yeah, so I guess I have a couple of preliminary remarks, but yeah, I think the Orthodox are they have to be taken seriously, because what it looks like to them, it looks like you're selling a Jaguar, 2020 Jaguar on one side, and then you've got this 2020 Lamborghini on the other side. They're both really beautiful cars. They're both really good cars, but this one doesn't have a gas tank.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's what it's like. You got Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, but then there's Pope Francis. So the car doesn't have a gas tank. So,
or I actually bought the Lamborghini, but they gave me a beat up Kia when they delivered the vehicle.
Right.
So
right, exactly. So the idea is, and it's a fair objection. When Jay Dyer brought it up, we just didn't have time to go into it. But if I can settle this issue just by knowing that there's no gas tank in that car, I don't need to go into history, Eric. I don't need to read Trevor Jalland and all these books and everything. It doesn't have a gas tank.
Right. Yeah,
you can solve it right now,
right?
And that's it. So there's that. There's the other issue is the Eastern Orthodox. They look at Roman Catholicism like an MMA. I don't know if some of the listeners watch MMA. I do. Forgive me. I know that some people don't agree with that, but mixed martial arts. They look at the papacy and Catholicism as if it's like an MMA fighter that's constantly in back-to-back championship title fights. Every mistake they make counts. Every loss counts. Every win counts. And so you can, the record of that professional MMA fighter, everything he does affects that record. Whereas for the Eastern Orthodox, they see themselves as like MMA fighters, but they're rarely ever in the ring, and they're always in the dojo just practicing. So whenever they mess up, whenever they fail, whenever they get knocked out, whenever they throw up, whatever it is, it doesn't count, But when Rome, we'll talk about Rome, everything she does counts. So, but for the Eastern Orthodox, the paradigm is different. The paradigm is different. It's like we're just practicing. It's just a dojo. None of this really matters. Yeah, you got one bishop does that. Yeah, you got this. No big deal, man. This is just Cliff Avenue, and this is, the boys. You guys are on television, pay-per-view, championship title fights all the time. And so whenever you lose, boom, it's big. So those two preliminary remarks I'd like to make. And if I were an Orthodox, I probably would have that impression, So the first thing I would say after my preliminary remark is this, that, yes, it's lamentable. The things that have happened in the Roman Catholic Church since the Second Vatican Council, and I would argue even before the Second Vatican Council, they're lamentable. I could just, my head can drop into my lap right now over what's going on. However, we have to be careful that we're not committing the fallacy where you're accusing somebody of a problem that you have yourself.
Well, one objection that's going to be raised is actually something I'm seeing in the chat. Emil says, well, the difference is our bishops don't claim to be the vicar of Christ with universal authority over spiritual matters and temporal matters. So there seems to be, a little bit of a difference. So the Pope is going to have to be held to a higher standard because he's making higher claims.
Yeah. Well, so let me finish my first thought, and then we'll get to that because that's a good one. So we go back to ecumenism. Ecumenism does not have a history in Catholicism alone, obviously. Ecumenism really started with the Protestants, and because they saw their differences, and they're like, this can't be the will of God, of Christ, So they got together and they wanted to be more ecumenical with each other. The Roman Catholic Church was very resistant because when the Roman Catholic Church heard about these Protestant meetings, what they interpreted that to mean was Roman Catholicism would come and level with them. And so you have all these condemnations, mortalium animus, you have all these condemnations, Pope Leo XIII, no meetings, don't get together with these people, just shut it down, close it out, nothing. But certain things changed. And obviously there was a lot of influence from Protestant scholars in Catholic academia. And so, Vatican II comes along, and Vatican II tries to stretch the limits while maintaining its claims of exclusivity. Because even a guy like James White will tell you, don't be fooled by Vatican II. It still says the Pope is infallible, the Pope has universal jurisdiction, and all these things. Okay, so it wanted to keep its foundational schema, but then it stretched it as much as it could to try and level with Protestants, while also telling the Protestant, well, you got to become a Catholic. But it's usually like the last thing they'd say, or if they ever said it. So you have this major shift in posture at the Second Vatican Council, especially with regard to how the state is to be understood, how the state what rights and prerogatives the state has under heaven with the true faith, and with Dignitatis Humanae. You've got Nostra Aetate, you've got all these documents. Essentially, if you read through it slowly, and if you don't have any prejudice, you just want to say, what is the Catholic Church saying? I think you could see continuity. And then the discontinuity is on this level of trying to be really nice, trying to be real leveled with the Protestants. And it causes confusion. But the Eastern Orthodox Church is not on the outside when this happens. The Eastern Orthodox Church has the same claims to infallibility as the Roman Catholic Church as a whole. If you read the Council of Jerusalem 1672, it talks I think in the decree 11, 12, or 16, I forget, but it talks about the infallibility of the church and the role that the church fathers and the bishops play in that infallibility. So the Orthodox Church can't exempt themselves from this. Okay, I refuse to accept that. So when they get involved with the ecumenical movement, they have opposition. Just like in Catholic Church, you had internal opposition. They had internal opposition. In Greece, Russia, you had a lot. I have got many books from Hockna, Holy Synod of Resistance, the Cyprianites, the Matthewites. They all go back and say, look, the Orthodox Church, the canonical Orthodox Church is not really following the canons. So I read them, and it's like reading the Sedevacantists, And so one of the biggest embarrassments of the Roman Catholic Church is the 1986 meeting at Assisi. And at that meeting, it wasn't just Catholics and all these other people who from different religions. there was a representative from each of the 14. If I don't know if it was all 14. I know it was at least 11, and it included Moscow and it included Constantinople.
But that's representatives. That's not the whole church.
Yeah, but here's the thing. When Arius taught that there was a time the sun was not,
mm-hmm.
the Orthodox Church then answered it,
Mm-hmm.
So if just being involved with this meeting was enough to prove that these representatives, they were clergymen too. They were clergymen.
Mm-hmm.
That they were perennialists, universalists, indifferentists, ecumenists, whatever, breaking all the canons. If that's what they were doing, then where in the Orthodox Church has there been a decree on the heads of these men?
Mm-hmm.
There's nowhere to be found. They went back to their sees. They went back to Moscow. They went back to Constantinople. They went back to Bulgaria, Romania, and they went back into their seats. Now, I'm not trying to say that Orthodoxy is just as bad as Catholicism. By far, I would say the Orthodox guy is going to be much safer right now. But what I'm trying to say is you have that meeting. Fast forward all the way up to today, you've got Pope Francis in office, and Patriarch Bartholomew doesn't look at Pope Francis like a lot of these clamoring Orthodox do. In fact, they're very good friends, and they've been on film praying together silently, but praying together shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, even with the Patriarch, the Coptic Pope of Egypt. Pope Francis wrote 2 books in 2019, one on the Mother Earth and one on prayer. And Bartholomew wrote a foreword to the one on Mother Earth. And Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, wrote a foreword to the Pope's book on prayer. It's published by the Vatican publication. So you wouldn't see Mark of Ephesus doing that. Let's be fair. Let's face it. You wouldn't see Mark of Ephesus writing a foreword to the book on prayer by Pope Eugenius IV. Okay, that's just not going to happen. So when the Orthodox want to point fingers and rap our knuckles about all these things that are happening in the Catholic Church, we have plenty to go back and forth about. And I really think it wastes time to do so because both of us have 2 feet planted in the same puddle of gasoline about to go up in flames if we're going to make this the be-all and end-all of ecclesiality. And, the Orthodox can say, like Jay Dyer would say, the paradigm is different, man. We're just in the dojo. You're in the championship fight. We're just practicing. I think there's limitations to that analogy because then it becomes a question of when is the Orthodox Church in the ring?
Mm-hmm.
When is she in the ring? And that's one of the reasons why a lot of Anglicans have looked over Orthodoxy, because there's been some breaking in the ground with contraception, divorce and remarriage. You have some Orthodox out there that say that divorce and remarriage, there's precedent in the early church fathers. Yeah, there's precedent for when there's adultery, that there may be a remarriage for the man, not the woman. But what we have in the canonical law in the Russian canonical law under the Tsars, the canonical law under the sultans in Constantinople, they started allowing divorce for all kinds of reasons, which far exceed what the patristics allowed. So, yeah, all right, fine. If you want to come and say that there was church fathers that allowed remarriage on a situation of adultery, all right, fine. I'm not going to argue with you. But when you're going to tell me that what is allowed today divorce based on abuse or financial scandal, that's nowhere in the patristics. Well, anyway, no, I don't want to get carried away here. What I would say is exactly what you did, Michael, with that show you did at the beginning. It was called Equal Weights, where we have to make sure that if we're going to light somebody on fire, or if we're going to refute a position, we have to make sure that we're not stuck in the same pile of gasoline. Because if we are,
well, let's assume for a moment that the Orthodox are not in the same pile and they're not on the same track as Roman Catholicism. So let's say in 50 years from now, they're not going to be as bad off as Catholicism. Now, let's just assume that hypothetically for the moment. What would you say to those who say, okay, look, yeah, some of these church leaders are compromised, but there are many laity and faithful in the Orthodox Church who are decrying the things that their leaders do. In fact, I know an individual who is part of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, and he's a lay faithful, but he actually thinks that his patriarch is a heretic. So there are quite a few people who would decry what these leaders are doing whenever they go to Assisi or they join Pope Francis. So why does it mean that the rest of the church is compromised? Why isn't it just limited to those individual bishops who are compromised when they go and participate in these ecumenical services?
Yeah, so if you read certain events in church history where there was an uproar because some bishops did something wrong, the unity of the church, there was this consciousness that if we keep communion with these people, we carry the burden of their sins. And I know that there's limitations to this because as centuries grew in the 8th, 9th century, you actually had a dispute between East and West on this very question about what can a lay person do if their clergy are compromised. Mm-hmm. And at the Council of the Orthodox call it the Council of First Second Council. It was the council that was held in 861. There were papal legates there. Yes, there were. And one of the decrees there, I think it's 14, 15, and 16, basically say that whenever your bishop or patriarch is compromised, you can kind of okay. Before I say this, I haven't read these in a long time, so forgive me if I'm wrong. But I'm pretty sure I remember it basically gives the lay person the green light to get up, walk away from that synod, that jurisdiction, and join another, and or just sever communion. Somebody can't just leave Corinth and go to Thessaloniki when they're a farmer. Mm-hmm. They've got their livelihood there. But they can still separate communion from their bishop because of heresy or whatnot. Well, Rome had a different perspective on this. Rome stuck to more of the Roman legal system, and would presume, and it wouldn't presume innocence all the time, but there's a presumption that there's, order must be maintained until the legality of the church had an answer for the situation. Council of 869, as you know, mm-hmm. Canon 5 or 21 says that a lay person can't just leave his church when his patriarch is a heretic, or his bishop is a heretic, or his metropolitan is a heretic. There must be a respect for the hierarchy. Right. So, I'm not sure where the Orthodox stand on that today. So for an individual,
I think actually that canon from 861 is actually still in the rudder.
Yeah, that's interesting. I heard that. It's really interesting. So let's give them the benefit of that. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what evil is being avoided by the Orthodox staying in that I don't have the benefit of avoiding as a Catholic?
Mhm.
I guess that might be the question I give that.
But here's my difficulty. If in fact, and I'm quite certain that canon from 861 that you mentioned there at the beginning is in the rudder, that would mean that, Orthodox should no longer be in communion with Patriarch Bartholomew. Because
Well, yeah,
he seems to have said some heretical things.
yeah. Well, according to I don't want to go on the record saying that but according to them, yes, I've heard Orthodox say that Bartholomew, and I have read some of the things that he has said, and it has really raised my own eyebrows.
Right.
Aside from his rejection of Catholic teaching,
Yeah.
which we would already say that is heretical, I would say is heretical. But yeah, I know personally people who would appeal to those canons, and but they're not canonical Orthodox.
Exactly, which is why you have to end up in, true orthodoxy.
Yeah, and what ends up happening? I had a friend of mine, and I think you met him years ago. His name won't be mentioned, but he was a traditional Catholic. He was totally disillusioned by Pope Francis. He went Orthodox. He said, "That's it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going Orthodox." So he went to the Antiochian church,
Mm-hmm.
and the liturgy and everything was gorgeous. And this is ancient Christianity. And look at these books, and look at the Filioque and all this stuff. But then he started talking to the people.
Mm-hmm.
He started to get to know the priest, and he realized that they're kind of like on the left a little bit, Yeah. So then he went. He left there, and I think he was received there, but he still left there because nowadays Orthodox priests, if you leave, they just say, "All right, fine, go in peace." They're not going to make a big fuss. Back in the 9th century, they wouldn't have done that, but today they'll just So he went to, I think, a church under the jurisdiction of Russia, and then when he was there is when he really started to learn about the uncanonical nature of the Church of Moscow under Patriarch Kirill. And that's when, in his conscience, he felt that he had to find the jurisdiction, the true church, the true Orthodox Church that's following the true canons, the true rudder, the true pedalion, and so his principles were driving him to that end. So I fear if I became Orthodox, that's where I would go. That's one of the reasons why I've got a big foot on the brakes when it comes to considering the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, and hopefully more to come on that topic in a future show. Let me ask a question that Luke, who's a good friend of mine, really good question that he asks here. What is your advice for someone in a stalemate between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy? If a person is genuinely seeking the true church, but cannot see which communion is unum sanctum, what should that person do?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is make sure that you're not living in sin. Make sure that you're pure, that you're praying, you're fasting, and you're doing good to your spouse, you're doing good to your friends, you're doing good to your children, because as St. Peter says, prayers can be hindered because of our sin. So you're really going to want to take this as a personal issue. God's not going to answer your prayers if your moral life is corrupt. That's number one. Number two, I would say pray, even if you're not going to be pure right now. Because even if you're living in sin, try to pray. Try to pray. Eventually, God gives power and graces in mysterious ways. I would say that, don't fear the scandal of the difference. You got Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism is like heaven, hell, heaven. Where am I going? What's going to happen if I die tonight? All this stuff. Don't carry that anxiety. Because if God is going to be that strict where he's not going to allow you into heaven because you didn't figure out that there was some forged documents that convinced you of the papacy, or you didn't find out that Hergenrother's scholarship on Photius was wrong and Dvornik's scholarship was right. I mean, there's so much involved in this debate. If God is going to be that kind of strict, arbitrary judge, then you're not going to go to heaven even if you're in the true church. You're going to do something there that's going to completely get him off he's going to completely lose control over you. So don't carry that anxiety. Always make sure that you realize that blindness, hiddenness from truth, it's all a result of the fall. It's all a result of the fall of man. It's all a result of sin. Some of our own sins cause us to have these problems. So there was a time where I got angry with God. I said, God, all I want to do is be your servant. All I want to do is be your slave. Why can't you make this more clear to me? I had to hide from the lightning because I have committed so many sins in my life. I have no right to that certainty. I need to fight my way for that certainty. I need to be able to pray and give my life to God before I can even ask him to give me that certainty. So don't carry that anxiety. And then number two, remember, you don't deserve an answer. Okay. You have to give to God. And this is kind of like what Job was doing for his children. He wasn't saying, "Oh God, you're the lover of mankind. I'm just going to let you love my children." No, he got up every morning and he made sacrifice and he prayed for them. So we don't deserve an answer. And then the other thing I would say is God still wants you to come to him with these issues. So love God with all your mind. So that means study the issue slowly, get good books, love God with all your mind, your heart, your soul, and your strength. So do good in your relationships, do good in your family, study the issues. And I think, and I'm confident enough in saying that God eventually will help you.
Well done. All right. Well, we're going to have to go ahead and end it here, but I think we're going to have a part 3, if I'm not mistaken, in the future. So we'll pick it up with more. Did you have any concluding thoughts you briefly wanted to touch on?
Yeah, no, the only thing I want to say is that, if some of the Orthodox listeners feel like that I was dogging them, I'm not. I have good friends that are Orthodox, but we have our differences, and we have to humbly accept that, while at the same time not just pretending like we're all in one big happy family. So take my words as a friend, please.
And at the end of the day, they don't have to deal with clown masses, right? There is something to be said there.
Until we see it on YouTube one of these days, and then it'll become the most popular clown mass. But I don't think the Orthodox will ever have clown.
I hate to say it, but I honestly do believe in the decades to come, it's going to go that direction. I think that the Orthodox are slow to adopt some of these things for various reasons, and that's a great thing, but I think it's going to
it's interesting you say that, because I know that some of the Coptic churches in America, the teenagers are befriending a lot of evangelicals, and
I've seen that.
So sometimes you'll see these Coptic churches saying, okay, well, we're going to have divine service, but then we're going to have like a contemporary meeting. So there's temptations.
Yeah.
And obviously the will is not evil. They're trying to reach out to the modern world. Yeah. But there's a trap there, and the Roman Catholic Church is exemplar number 1 for what a beautiful apostolic church can become.
Yeah. That's how it starts. If you trace the history of what has happened in the post-conciliar era, that's where it happened, is trying to reach out to the modern world. And not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying the way in which it was done was very badly conducted. So, Orthodox would do very well to learn from the mistakes of the post-conciliar era, but unfortunately, I don't know if that's going to actually happen. So we'll see. All right. Well, everyone, thank you for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, share this on your social media. Eric, thanks for coming on. Always a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you.
Okay. Everyone, have a good one.